And the presentation will be available on the ITSM wiki page within 5 or so business days after the presentation. Brian Newcomb is our first panelist. And then we have Peter Mosinskis. He is the Director of IT Strategy at California State University, Channel Islands. And finally, we have Robert England. He is a Managing Director at Two Hills Limited. Okay, so without further ado, I will start with the first question. So we'll start with the basic question, and that is, what is Standard+Case?
I guess I should take that one. So Standard+Case is an approach. There's methodological aspects to it, but it's primarily a way of thinking about how we respond to any situation. And it originates out of an IT background. I'm a service management guy myself, and I've known Brian for many, many years. And I was wrestling with the idea of the thoughts around how do we improve how we respond in an IT context. You know, primarily service desk, but anything at all, change, any response, any situation. And someone had pointed me to case management. And so Charlie Betts pointed me to case management. So when I looked at case management, then the synthesis of the way we traditionally do ITIL type processes and the body of knowledge known as case management, it occurred to me that the two of them together were yin and yang and gave a response. So in ITIL thinking, we try and standardize everything and treat everything we do as standard work. And by that, I mean work where we have a definition of how we should deal with it. You know, that could be something in a knowledge base or a script or automation in a workflow or anything, but we have standardized how we deal with that situation. And anything that falls outside that standardization is treated as an exception, even a failure sometimes of our systems. Why don't we have this stuff standardized? And that's not the real world, right? So stuff that comes in is constantly non-standard. And so when we're trying to deal with situations that are unknown to us, that we don't have a predefined way of dealing with them, that's case management, as in legal case, medical case, police case. And so there's a whole body of knowledge around how you deal with cases, generically, whatever they may be. And so Standard+Case is the synthesis of that classical service management standard thinking with the ideas of case management. And when you put the two together, then you have something that will deal with everything in the real world, the stuff you already know and the stuff you don't know. How's that?
Yeah, I like the description that you use, Rob. When I get a lot of questions too about, well, you know, we have ITIL, you know, and how does that work and what's the difference, and in explaining Standard+Case and you know, in my current role, which is not necessarily directly in IT, it's been very helpful to look at this. But I like the way you described it. You know, when you had said that, you know, ITIL is about first and foremost understanding what you're dealing with, what is, whereas Standard+Case is first and foremost looking at how are we going to respond, right? Is it going to be in a standard predefined way that's very scripted, or one of those things that kind of falls off the page, or it can't be flow charted and you know, logic isn't defined.
Exactly. And so we see these the whole body of knowledge behind this stuff. Cynefin is a Cynefin is a model for situational response, which is more complex than Standard+Case. But you know, it's a nice simple approach because it allows us to work the way we currently work, to try and standardize everything we can possibly standardize, and to measure and manage standard work in the way that we currently measure and manage it. But I think one of the key insights is that we shouldn't measure and manage work that falls outside of our standardization in the same way that we measure and manage work that does. And so that's a solution to that age-old problem of the long tail on our statistics for, say, incident management, where we get 95% of our incidents resolved within, you know, the required period. And then we have this long tail of long-running incidents that seem to take forever. And what Standard+Case tells us is that those are a mixture of incompetence and failed process where they should have been done quicker, but also A lot of them are in fact cases, which means we're dealing with, whether you're a policeman or a doctor or an IT professional, you don't know what sequence of steps you're going to take to solve that case. It's unknown at the point at which you start, and all you can do is be agile. There's a lot of crossover here to agile thinking. All you can do is explore and sense your way forward to understand what is the next state you should move to, and well, what are your options for next state to move to, and then choosing one of those states and getting to that, and then re-examining your situation and saying, where are we now? What do we know now that we're in this new state? What have we learned? Okay, what does that mean about our options for another state to move to? Okay, let's move to that state. So, you know, if a doctor's diagnosing a patient, or a policeman's understanding a crime scene, or an IT professional is understanding an incident, we're probing our way forward, and nobody can predict in advance what sequence of steps we'll go through. And so therefore they can't predict how much resource it's going to take, how long it's going to take, or even what the outcome will be. And that's a huge shift in thinking for a lot of classical IT process management, especially ITIL.
I want to build on what Rob had just mentioned regarding how, in terms of what we've seen in practice and applying Standard+Case, and some other things that hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about regarding how we use the nomenclature regarding standard and non-standard items. I think for us has been a big part of implementing this and helping really people that are using this process, people that are involved in this process, make sense of what it means. But to the point of the special cases and figuring out how to move forward with cases, in our own experience, we've actually found that even in cases, when we're dealing with things that we would consider to be non-standard, we're still able to, using Standard+Case, still set up a consistent, sort of a consistent flow for certain processes. So even though it's not, things may not happen, things may not take exactly the same amount of time to complete each time, but in many cases, especially if we're dealing with creating a consistent process, even in even thinking about the case aspect of managing that process, and IT procurement is one of the areas that's sort of near and dear to my heart, and where we've used Standard+Case. But being able to put some general boundaries around and really create some definitions around how things are handled in essentially the realm of the case, even though the timelines may be wide varying, but the kind of steps that we're taking in the case situation may still be very consistent and very repeatable.
Yeah, very true. So
great point.
One way of looking at that is that we can have a fairly common process for how we deal with each state, and we're just not sure how many times we're going to iterate that.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it's good to know that, you know, the standard's obviously very, very prescribed, but and those things that aren't standard become cases, but it doesn't mean that cases or case management is a free-for-all. There's still structure. It may not have as much and as detailed in terms of how we go about it, because we've not seen it before, and it does require those subject matter experts to use their knowledge and do what it takes to get it done, but with some still level of guardrails in place so that we get some very basic transparency and metrics for continual improvement and so forth.
So, Peter, do you and the rest of the panelists, do you find that you need to implement Standard+Case as a methodology, or someone mentioned Agile, do you use just kind of the ideas of philosophy of Standard+Case?
Yeah, so in our case, again, one of the places that we found a lot of success in using Standard+Case is with regards to IT procurement. And we really, you know, at the most fundamental level, just use the concept of standard and non-standard items. And again, this is where it gets into nomenclature for us. When we're talking about IT procurements, at a very basic level, we started implementing pieces of Standard+Case, was articulating and creating the language and creating the conversation on things that are non-standard, and things that are standard. We call things that are non-standard custom. So for procurements, we might have standard procurements of things that we normally buy in a commodity sort of way, desktops, laptops, etc. And then the things that are non-standard, those things that you might buy every once in a while, a new software product for our campus, maybe a drone or some other kiosk that maybe we're using for the first time in our organization. So at least being able to help people understand that there may be sort of big buckets to organize, to sort of mentally organize, well, this is what I'm buying, and this is sort of giving me a more direct route to take to get whatever I need to have done, and mentally organize, okay, now I understand which path I want to take.
Yeah, you can certainly apply it either way in that spectrum. There's a lot of, there is a book, get a little mention in, there is a book around this stuff, and yeah, there we go. And yeah, we could, ta-da! So,
it's at the ready.
Yeah, I was rereading it last night, actually. There is a book, so there's a whole lot of methodological stuff in there, so one could get quite deeply into it, but at its heart, it's just a principle, as you're saying, Peter. It's a way of thinking about the stuff that expands our thinking to understand that there's known and unknown, and take us down that path. And how much you then dig into the detail of it and unpack that and apply it is very situational, I think, and contextual as to how much you want to do that.
Yeah, I think the answer to the question is it's either or. You know, especially where I'm at. You know, we're still very early in implementing, and I would say that, you know, right now we are using the ideas. Remember, you know, after 15 years in IT service management, I'm in the Office of Human Resources now, and it's a lot of HR service management, and you know, taking the book. That's why I have it so close. It was nice to be able. It doesn't read like an IT manual. It certainly doesn't read like an ITIL book. I've been able to take these ideas and even take, you know, pieces from that and use it effectively with kind of more of a non-IT or business area audience. And you know, there's some good, you know, good ideas in there to start with, and then for the folks that are kind of responsible for putting together, making it work, like myself, you know, I can take out and actually look at, you know, borrowing some of those flow charts and those more specific kind of ideas to really help get a jump start on making something reality.
Yeah.
Did any of you find it, those who in the panels that have implemented Standard+Case, what were some of your biggest challenges implementing Standard+Case in your teams?
So I guess I can start this off. We started implementing, so we're using Standard+Case in a couple of areas, one in our IT change control process, and more recently in our IT procurement process. I would say from the IT procurement standpoint, two of the areas where we've had the biggest challenges are first around the discipline around regularly reviewing and updating standards. Because from an IT procurement process, you know, we have desktops, laptops, tablets, quotes that we have that are valid for a certain period of time that within a certain period of time expire and need to be updated, or because of technology changes, those standards have to really regularly, continually be updated. So being able to have the discipline around looking at that list of standards that we have and going through them and making sure that things are accurate and up to date. The good thing is, from a procurement standpoint, people seem to catch on the process that we have in place. If a standard goes out of date, okay, a red flag is thrown up at some point when procurement tries to make a purchase. They have an out-of-date quote, so we have to get the process up to date. I wouldn't say that we're doing a good job of thinking about that in advance. Also, the creation of new standards. So figuring out at what point you decide to make a new standard out of, and I think we're going to talk about that later. So that is a challenge. What kinds of standard items do we have? We have a ton of standard software for that the campus has. Do we make it easy? How easy do we make it for people to procure that kind of standard software? The last challenge I would say would be regarding workflows. That's another big aspect. So every time you have a sort of a standard process and a case process, there is some kind of a process indicates that there's some kind of workflow. Things have to happen in a certain way. So defining what those workflows are and continually refining them for things that are standard, for things that are non-standard, and then for things that may be in a gray area where you maybe want to make them standard, that does take a considerable investment of time to make sure that things continue to work as expected.
Yeah, one of the things we're working on, we're in the process of working through the challenge now, is to understand, for standards, do you need to automate? Does standard mean it's automated, right? The thought that you can automate, a response to every standard may not be the case, right? And I think there's a bit of an 80-20 as well, or a return on the investment. Some of those standards, it's really just document, and it's still going to require someone making contact with a human being who has access to look up the prescribed standard and deliver the defined response. Whereas in other cases, our tools permit us to really automate more end-to-end that response in to certain standards. But it's not at all or nothing, and it doesn't mean that if it's a standard, it's automatic and automated. So finding the right blend is a challenge, I think.
But a key element there is that you can only automate standard work. Yeah,
right. Yeah, there's no automating the casework, and I guess to the other half of the challenge too is, with that ROI, there's a difference, for non-automated standard work in terms of the cost to respond versus the cost to respond to casework. So I know, we're all familiar with levels, tier 1 or tier 2, and of course the adage, solve more of it at self-service, or at tier 1 is cheaper than, involving the resources that we have at tier 2 and tier 3. With the Standard+Case, from what I've experienced so far is, the standards are the standard. The cases, it's not like a level 2 escalation. I feel like we're a university of exceptions constantly. I mean, not a day goes by that we don't find something that we've never seen before. And when those come up, again, it's not a level 2. It is a subject matter expert that, in our world traditionally, you've jumped. It's very expensive.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting things I think that is a challenge is you can't measure cases statistically very easily. The numbers around cases are less interesting than they are around standard work, because you know what standard numbers should be and you can measure what you get and know how well you're doing. But when cases are all different in terms of duration and effort and even outcome, then the aggregate statistics are less interesting. And so the best way to gather data out of non-standard work is to review some or all of the cases as they close and learn what you can from each case. Maybe sampling, or maybe looking at outlier cases, or there's some stuff in the book about, and under what conditions you might want to review cases. But by looking at the non-standard, and I'm jumping to our last question again, like you, Peter, here, but by looking at the non-standard ones, we can learn, are there better ways of doing work? We can spot new techniques that people have invented to deal with cases. And we can also spot where there's a pattern emerging, and hey, we're doing a few of these. And by learning from what the caseworkers did to solve them, using that to inform the creation of standard models. So So that review process is actually quite a key part, I think, of the case management, to have some sort of pattern, regular behavior to review cases, and some people who do it, and an active activity to create the feedback loops. I'm a DevOps guy these days, and you know, it's all about feedback, getting information back to where it needs to be. And so I feel that one of the big challenges for organizations is going to be the discipline of doing reviews, because I know in general in IT we suck at reviewing, you know, post-incident reviews and post-implementation reviews. We either get really bad at doing them, or we do them as theatre, as rich. We do them, we don't really do them. And whereas in case management, you've got to really do them, and you've got to do them well. And I feel like that's a step up for a lot of organizations as well. Thoughts?
Peter, you mentioned earlier about using Standard+Case in your IT change management. Can you talk just a sec about that for the benefit of our audience?
Sure. I mean, again, from a conceptual level, we have implemented Standard for IT changes as part of our standard practice for change management. We have different kinds of changes. So we have things that are normal changes that meet a certain set of criteria. We have things that are urgent or emergency changes, which have basically, they need to be taken care of more quickly or handled in a different way. And then we have changes that are standard changes. So, for example, a standard change might be a change to one of our firewall rules that we do on a regular basis, but it doesn't necessarily have to go through exactly the same approval process. Let's say that a normal or urgent change would need to go through, because it is something that is regular and repeats basically on a consistent basis. So, and that's been useful. I mean, again, we at the very least we're able to then look at the kinds of changes that come through and see, well, are we spending more time? How's that actually working out? And having those standard items actually cuts down on the amount of time that we have to spend, dealing with those change requests overall, and we can focus on the ones that are those special cases.
Yeah, absolutely. Go on, bro.
No, I just wanted to follow up, Mitch. I don't want to steal your thunder, but I got a question I got to ask, Peter. I heard some buzzwords in there, some best practice buzzwords. How would you respond if I or anyone would say, so Peter, are you following best practice? Are you following ITIL? Do you do change management, or is this in place of that?
That's what I'm curious.
Or would you argue that, yes, we have best practice and change models are really our standards? How do you kind of coalesce all these things?
Well, I think with applying any kind of methodology, any kind of approach, it's figuring out what's going to work for your organization in general. So whether you're talking about ITIL, whether you're talking about Standard+Case, we generally take the approach of figure out what works for your organization, for the people and your organizational culture, and adopt those pieces. You don't have to do everything in ITIL or Standard+Case, in my opinion, to actually get some immediate value out of it. So,
and Standard+Case is one of the. It's actually one of the areas that's most weakly done of ITIL, I think, a lot of organizations. So it's really good that you're drawing out that standard work doing that, because most organizations don't do anywhere near enough standardization of change.
Yeah.
That's one area where ITIL comes closest to this thinking, I guess, is this idea of standard change and non-standard change, and having a much more complex process for non-standard change. But I do think that case management helps improve the ITIL thinking for non-standard change. And so again, there's a bit in the book about that and how they sort of relate and cross over. But the word standard actually comes from ITIL, and there's a lot of awareness of standard change, but ITIL also talks about standard incidents and even talks about standard problems, would you believe? And all they mean is that you have a model or a template for performing that kind of incident. And in the change context, as you said, Peter, they add more to it and say that it therefore means it's pre-approved and so on.
Exactly.
Yeah, so in Standard+Case, we're using the word standard in the same general sense as ITIL to mean somewhere where there's a template or a script or a definition or a process or an automation or a workflow to say, here's how you do this thing.
I asked that question because it puts a whole new kind of spin on standard, normal, and emergency types of changes when you look at it in the context of standard plus the ones that don't match your standard type of changes. So good conversation. The next question here. So what is the minimum level and approach to documenting knowledge or standards for a Standard+Case to be effective and worthwhile?
Well, I'm happy to jump in on this as well. Minimum level, again, it depends on where you're applying standards in the processes that you're overseeing. Okay, from an IT procurement standpoint, I could say that most people in higher ed, given the thin amount of resources that we have to support technology in most of our organizations, benefit hugely from having standards. I mean, thinking about having a standard desktop or laptop set of computers that can be regularly re-imaged within a university environment, and that creates efficiencies for support. So, putting standards in place in any kind of process at even just the most fundamental level, I think, creates efficiencies. And how much do you need? I mean, you could start with setting one or two or a handful of items as standards, and thinking about the process that will go into supporting whatever that standard is.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's a rock bottom to this. I think start with nothing, and again, to the agile principle of iterate and increment and, grow your way forward organically, then, start with whatever you've got, because you'll have something written down somewhere. And so for me, the primary thing is to have a feedback process in place, to have the activity and the people doing the work so that you're capturing this stuff, so that you're continually improving those standards. And so long as you're improving those standards, then you'll get better over time. So, there's no minimum base that you have to have before you can start, and there's no optimal level. You're just continually on this journey of creating standardized work, because as far and so people have to be doing custodianship, maintaining the quality of standardized work. And also the world has this nasty habit of continually changing. So just as we think we're closing in on having a good definition of what we do, it'll change. And suddenly new requests, new situations will start coming in, which the people don't know how to handle in a standardized way. And they'll start, suddenly the experts, the caseworkers will start getting this flow of new stuff coming up. They'll go, whoa, something's happened here. And so then that review process of ours kicks in and goes, whoa, we're starting to get a lot of these. There must be a new iPhone on the market or something. And so we need to do capture what we're learning from these cases and do some more standardization. So the activity, I think, is more important than the content itself.
So Peter or Brian, a question came in from Kevin. He's asking if any of you have actually implemented Standard+Case within a service management tool. And I'm not sure which your tool of choice is, but have you actually implemented it in the tool itself?
Brian, you want to take that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I would take it more so from my other hat and in my relationship with our IT group, because whether they know it or not, they have. Think about ServiceNow and the request catalog. they've got a number of defined requests. And when I say defined requests, these are requests that can be made that have a workflow attached, with specific tasks. If they ask for this, here's the 3 steps. This task, it goes to that person, they do this. Once it's done, it goes to this person, they do that. Then it goes here, closed, bam. That's standard, and they've implemented those with workflows. But we know that not everything is going to follow one of those. And even if they do, again, 80/20. Doesn't pay to tool up and automate every single thing everyone could possibly ask for. So there's going to be things that don't, and either we have knowledge, again, standard, or what they've got in there is there's this option, so they got the whole catalog of requests, and then there's this option that says something else, or I don't see what I want here.
Not
right?
in catalog.
Not in catalog.
Yes.
And there's no workflow. It goes to the service desk, and they just kind of have to I don't want to say wing it, but they're going to follow their process. They call it a generic request. Those are really the cases. And again, by assessment of those, over time you can see where there's commonalities. We can add more in, and around the efficiencies go. So that's my thought on it. Others may have another example.
Yeah. So at the very simplest, that's all you need to do is to say, in your list of standards, if people are coming in through some sort of request catalog, not in catalog, which takes you to a generic undefined workflow for case. And then another thing you can do in the tool is define a different status. So you might have a status which is resolving, working on it. You can create another status which is working on it in an unknown way and call it case or whatever you want to call it. And so that allows you, when you're reporting and review, to know that as soon as it goes into a case status, we're not expecting it to meet any SLAs for time anymore. So adding another status to your tool to say this is now in case status, I think, is also useful. So those would be the 2 main things. And so any old ticketing tool in the world can have one more option in the types to say not in catalog or not known, and one more status to say there's a caseworker working on it.
I'm going to steal that, Rob. Not in catalog. I like that. My request catalog, not in catalog. Instead of generic request. I like that. So.
Yeah, that's great. So I have a sort of a slightly different spin on it. I may have mentioned before, and this gets to Kevin's question. We're using Team Dynamics as our service management platform, and so we built out our IT procurement process using basically two different requests. So if someone is buying a piece of standard IT equipment, it goes through a standard request process. If they're buying something that is non-standard custom request, it goes through a different process. In both cases, the process is actually, for our purposes, the process is very well defined. It goes either direction. So if it goes through a standard process, that process is much shorter in terms of actual time spent. The custom or non-standard process takes significantly longer because we're having to discover information about the product that's being purchased. How that's actually implemented in our system, it's a set of forms. Those forms in Team Dynamics go in and create 2 separate ticketing workflows. So they create a set of tasks. So in a standard workflow, it creates a certain set of standard tasks, and those tasks are individual tickets assigned to technicians or people in our procurement office. Same thing with the non-standard flow. It's the same thing. We have a workflow with a set of tasks, assigned a slightly different set of people. In both cases, the tasks end with a task that's assigned to someone in our procurement office that actually creates the purchase order and sends that to the
So I think there's a slightly different level here as well then, Peter. What happens if I ring up and say I'd like to buy a something that you've never heard of before?
Yes.
Does that become a custom procurement, or
yes.
What if you're not even sure whether I'm allowed to buy it, or
basically anyone can submit in our case, anyone can submit a custom procurement for anything that anyone wants to buy. I mean, it gives, really, this helps us solve one of our fundamental IT governance problems of understanding what customer needs are and matching those up to services that we may already provide, or services that may be better practices for what people are trying to do. So we encourage people to submit those into one of those two categories, is if it's not an IT procurement. So if you're buying a tractor for facilities.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I get at. What happens if I ring up and say, buy me a tractor?
If that actually is a completely separate process, that's essentially out of the scope of what we're looking at within the bounds of our.
Yeah, because Andrea's just asked a question about how do you differentiate. I want to come back to the tools too, so don't let me forget. But Andrea said, how do you differentiate between what is a case and what is simply not supported by the service desk and we really shouldn't be dealing with? And so, part of the not in catalog option, I'm interested in the way that you've got a lot of structure around custom, because there's also another scenario, which is, we're not even sure whether we cover that or not when we go into not in catalog branch.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that for your area of procurement, it's quite well defined, but in other areas, you get into that scenario where I don't even know whether we can do this for you or not. And so then the optimum customer service model is to say, listen, that's not one of my standard things I can do for you. I'm not really sure we can do for you or not. I'm just transferring this to a caseworker, and the first thing they'll do is actually determine whether we can help you or not.
Exactly.
And whereas the old response quite often was, well, it's not one of the things in my catalog, so sorry, and you'll have to go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to get to a more sophisticated model where we go, let me go find out if we can do that for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to some degree, I think in our instance, it does come down to certain organizational or functional boundaries of how you define, how you implement case management or Standard+Case. So the example of the tractor, well, buying a tractor is outside of the scope of the services. It is really out of that catalog. It's out of the scope of the services that IT as an organization provides.
But who knows it's out of scope? The expert, the caseworker.
Right.
So a lot of your standard workers won't know.
Yes.
They'll go, oh, a tractor. Oh, don't. Oh, tractor? So, it is the caseworker's job to actually, one of the first things they have to determine is whether we can actually deal with this.
Yes, exactly.
Because a lot of times we haven't been able to document a finite list of what we do and don't do, right? I know my time at the service desk here at campus, we've taken everything from there's a stray dog in the classroom to, you never know, right?
In IT, certainly, we love to define everything. And I always talk about this in the different context, major incident. People say, how do we define what constitutes a major incident or not? And I say, you'll know it when you see it, right? A major incident is when you look at it and you go, oh, this is major, right? To try and define all the possible scenarios which constitute a major incident in advance will actually cripple your ability to deal with a major incident. Because as soon as something else comes along, they go, oh, I'm sorry, but isn't in my list of major incidents, so a major incident,
Right. Absolutely.
And so again, trying to define every possible kind of request that's going to come in is counterproductive to what we do.
Agreed.
The world, as fast as you get that correct, the world will change, and new stuff will come along that was never part of what you thought about at the time that you defined all possible.
So before I move on to the next question, I think, Rob, you had a point to make about the tool.
So tooling, yeah, thank you.
Sure, of course.
So having said that it's really simple and all you have to do is create another category and another option in the catalog, there's sophisticated tooling around case management because case managers have special needs in terms of, and it's very knowledge-centric rather than activity-centric. So a case manager, when they reach a certain state, wants to gather together and aggregate a whole lot of data and a whole lot of people and resources and do a whole lot of collaboration. Casework tends to be multi-person. And so there are specific case management tools that deal with the sophistication of case management. And most of those tools are not IT specific, although there's a whole body of knowledge called adaptive case management, ACM, who are IT people, and they've got ACM tools, and IBM's got one, and one of the leading thinkers from it is from Fujitsu, so I'm going to bet they've probably got one. And there is case management capabilities, I think, in Snow and ServiceNow, and I talked to the guys at Sherwell at the stage about the possible. So there's nothing to prevent you growing into more sophisticated tooling, but again, I think I always talk again in all sorts of other contexts, but never lead with the tooling, right? So as you get into this stuff and as you grow in your capability and sophistication, you'll identify needs for tooling. And so, yeah, I don't want to give the impression that it's really only really simple. That's a good place to start. And then you can look at more sophisticated tools that help specifically around the practice of case management. I don't know what you guys have seen in that space, if anything. Brian, you might have been around.
Yeah, not a whole lot. No, we've been actually looking at the market right now for case specific case management in the HR finance, and we're looking at how to solve that, what the right technology is going to be for us, and at the same time with the recognition that we do collaborate at an administrative systems level with our central IT group, right, who have their IT service management tooling. So, either we need to figure out how to be in the same tool or figure out how to have two-way integrations so that, we can do this without throwing stuff over a blind wall. That's actually something that's a current body of work right now for me.
Yeah, I think, Rob, you make an excellent point. Any process, start with where you want to go, what you want to do, define your process, get people on board, and then grow into it. So excellent point. This question's, I think, right down your alley, Brian. This for Standard+Case use in non-IT areas, how do we show them value or gain buy-in to do anything structured?
Yeah, that's a good point, and that was one of the kind of things where certainly dropping 5 too. Probably not going to go very far in an HR or a finance or a procurement kind of world on our side. So I think the value, showing the value is that there is some structure and there's some value to having some structure, right? That's I think the biggest hurdle to overcome, because in many cases I think folks are coming from just having that complete autonomy, do whatever it takes, and at the end of the day, we don't have any tangible, objective data to go back in and look for where do we need more resources, where do we need improvements, where are we doing a good job, where do we have opportunities for improvement. It's all anecdotal, right? And the first thing that you get with anecdotal, I need more people, or we're having a tough time, when we take it up the chain to leadership is, show me, prove it. And that's one of the first benefits that we see is that we can have some objective information to put back into continual improvement. At the same time, I think that we're able to show value in consistency without stifling creativity or stifling the autonomy that our caseworkers need to deal with these things that come up that we've never seen before, right? That is not documented anywhere, and letting folks know that we can have structure without having without killing that kind of freedom to do what we trust you to do, what we hired you to do. We trust you to do what we hired you to do. We know you have the knowledge to do it. I don't want to get in your way. I just ask for some basic information so that we can understand where we're doing well and where we can improve.
And one of the things I talk about in the book is that we don't trust everybody. So, as people are new to the job or frankly are just not terribly good at dealing with unstructured work, then by separating out standard and case, we can put the newbies on the standard work where they're safe, where they can learn, where they don't feel that they're thrown in the deep end with dealing with a case the day they start a job. And some people may never get out of that space because of their own personal competencies. And it's the people who have the experience and the capabilities who we anoint, who we say, okay, you are a caseworker. And so there's at an individual level, there's a value sell to people as well, to say to some people, look, you're going to do structured work while you learn the space. And they go, oh, good. And to other people to say, look, you're not going to be doing the same old horrible drudge work all the time. We're giving that to the newbies we're going to give you the really interesting, gnarly stuff to work with.
Yeah, there's that career path kind of built in to show people, and I find it interesting because I think we've probably all had the experience where you can have a customer service interaction with someone, a company, an airline perhaps, and the ones that have identified and given autonomy to people to take care of the customer. They've made it clear how far they're allowed to go, right? Is really left up to the employee, at the situation to make it on the fly, and folks back them up, right?
That's another
think about your favorite theme park down in Florida. If there's a problem, those folks that work there, every time I've gone, you can feel that they're empowered to take care of the customer, to make it right? And there's a wide range of things they can do. Versus other experiences that you may have had that you hit that point where they say that's all I can do. There's nothing more I can do. That's one of my key kind of pet peeve statements. There's nothing more I can do, right? And I think that's a huge customer service value, and that career ladder piece to kind of anoint those folks and be able to give them some authority and some autonomy. Let them know where that threshold is, but how far they go towards it is something that we trust them to kind of do in their role.
So that's a really important point, is around thresholds and so on. So caseworkers in general, knowledge workers in general, the difference between clerical workers and knowledge workers is primarily the difference between standard work and casework, right? And for knowledge workers in general, if you empower them to figure out how to do the work, then one of the most important things, other than review, which we talked about, at the other end is putting policy in. So you should never set people free without telling them where the fences are. It's not fair to them, and it's not safe for you. So it's really important to have policy to say, here's your boundaries, soft and hard boundaries, so that you know within where you can operate. And now you're a knowledge worker. Within that space, go for it. Figure it out.
I wanted to add, those are such great points in terms of development from a development standpoint. I think that's a huge value for taking this kind of approach. Really, the other place where we get a lot of value, I think, at the core of this is creating efficiency, essentially enabling efficiency. One of the key overlaps, I think, with this kind of approach and how we show value in things that are structured is thinking about lean and the idea of the lean methodology, where you're creating consistent, repeatable processes that you can essentially evaluate, measure, and improve. If you don't have if you can't describe a process or a current consistent process, you can't really improve it. Or it's much more I should say it's much more difficult to improve it, because it's difficult to figure out where are the gaps, where are the problems in that specific process. So I think this is one piece of that puzzle, or one piece that I think helps add context to that solving that puzzle.
Yeah, at a process level, one of the really exciting things for me as I've unpacked all this plays to Kevin's question there. Where in a proper post review, those grey area items should decrease over time as you add to your catalogue or knowledge base and so on. And that's exactly it. So that if you've got this feedback loop in place, that we are reviewing cases, not necessarily all, but we're reviewing cases and we're acting on what we learn to generate not only improvements to how we do case management, which is your basic feedback loop, but your other feedback loop is we're generating standardization. So that to me is quite a profound thing once you really understand what it means. It means that you've created a self-evolving system that is constantly trying to increase the standardization of your environment. And not only is it constantly trying to increase your standardization, but it's trying to do that in a changing world. So every time the world changes, as I said earlier, this system just picks that fact up and and identifies the new patterns and shoves them back into standard.
Okay, Kevin's question leads nicely into our last question. What practices do you follow to keep standards up to date and decide when to convert a case item into a standard item?
So I'm happy to jump in on this again. For us, it's just a matter of setting up some kind of schedule to check things regularly, and especially if you have an automated system. For example, if you're delivering a quote on your website and you know that quote is going to be good for 90 days, then hopefully you have some way within your web content management system, or even if it's just putting an alert on your own personal calendar to say, hey, this quote is only good for 90 days. At 80 days, I need to get a new quote, or whatever that's going to be. But setting up processes to enable regular review of those items, I think is really important. And then I think I think it was Rob that mentioned earlier, looking at the bulk of what kinds of cases you have and determining, well, are we having things happen more than once? In my opinion, if something happens more than once, you should consider whether that's a case or actually a standard item. If it's happened 3 times, I think the more time goes on, the more you can make a case, no pun intended, for creating a standard or standardizing the response to a specific incident, issue, service request, or whatever.
Absolutely. And as there's a rule in the DevOps world, if you do something 3 times, you should think about automating it. So, yeah, I'd take your one and I'd say if you do it more than once, you should think about standardizing it. And if you do it more than 3 times as a standard, you should think about automating it. Would be a nice mantra.
That's a great rule of thumb. Yeah.
Yeah. So the key thing for me in keeping up to date is that there is what you said, Peter, there is a practice in place. There's somebody doing something. So having a standard, having a defined practice in place, improvement, and really good at writing improvement plans and improvement rules, but never actually defining that somebody's going to do something. So having a practice in place. And so therefore the other implication with your standard work is someone who owns responsibility for that. So someone who's the custodian of those standard templates, who's therefore responsible for that activity, you said. And then the third thing is, as I said, is these feedback loops. So somewhere you're capturing new stuff to feed in. So, I'm the abstract thinker, but I say, practices in place, custodian accountability, and feedback loops.
Yeah, dedicated resource is to that practice, that capability is a definite must. I've seen it try to work where we took well, everyone's going to contribute, everyone's going to take a couple hours a week from their time and do this type of activity. And while we may need to spread the wealth in terms of the owners of specific knowledge or specific standards, without that custodian really owning the practice and making sure that it's happening, we get busy. It tends to be, one of the last things that we worry about when the heat gets turned up, and is the first thing to fall off the plate when the priorities overwhelm us. So,
I'm a massive fan of wikis, but they're rubbish unless they have a defined custodian with sufficient ring-fence time to actually groom them constantly and keep them in a good shape.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I encourage you to submit your questions through Q&A. Any final thoughts from our panelists before we wrap up?
So I think, for us, the idea of Standard+Case, if nothing else, has been great. It's provided us with a lot of value for being able to set benchmarks and to share data. I mean, we've been able, from a procurement standpoint, I can tell you over the last year, our central IT office captured over 420 IT procurements. Of those, about 50% were standard and 50% were non-standard. So we actually have data that we can act on. We can share that information with all the people that are involved in the process and figure out what we can do to make things more efficient, make things go more quickly for that process. Without having the data before, people would get frustrated, but it'd be difficult to have a conversation. because it wasn't clear exactly what was going on, and it's a lot clearer now.
Yeah, I'll say from a non-IT role right now, it's been very, and in the process of using this, right? So it's not something we've been using for years at this point. It's something that is part of a current project to improve service and provide a more consistent and efficient, excellent experience for folks. So having something to leverage that is pretty easily understood makes putting some easy to explain has been very helpful for me.
And I'd just say this is just a different lens on how we do things now. So it's a different way of thinking about what you already do in order to improve the way you work. So, I hope everybody will give it a look. I'll just drop the link in the general chat for the primary page for resources about this thing. And, in my humble opinion, I think it should get more attention than it does. So I'd love for people to spread the word and give it a look.
Yeah, and this was a follow-up. This panel was a follow-up to a session that we talked about a few months ago. I'm sure any of us we'd love to talk about it or do more if I guess get involved or speak up, and we can have more conversations.
Yeah, both the resource to the book and to the link were in the invitation or the announcement for this panel. It'll also be posted on the wiki site within 5 business days. Thank you, Rob, Brian, and Peter. Appreciate taking your time out to talk to us about Standard+Case. This concludes the panel discussion. Again, I'd like to thank you for sharing your time with us. They've been kind enough to provide their contact information here, as you can see on the screen. We're always looking for fresh ideas, so if you have an idea for a webinar or have a desire to present, please contact me. Thank you again for your time, and everyone have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.